And if you haven't already, I'm assuming you have, but I'm going to say it again anyway. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to turn with me there to that passage, Colossians chapter 3. We're going to be in verses 11 through 17. I'm going to really focus on the first 3 verses. We're not going to get through all of it because there's a lot packed into these verses, and you'll see why we're not going to go through all of it and why we're going to just focus on verses 11 through 14. But I asked 2 questions at the beginning of the service, which some of you weren't here to hear those 2 questions. But here's the 2 questions. Number 1, if you were to describe the perfect church, how would you describe it? What things would you include? What are the things? If you were to describe somebody to say, hey, what's the ideal church? What's the perfect church? What would you say about that? And now some of you are here, maybe you're visiting, maybe you're looking for a home church. There are a lot of people who are going around who are looking for the perfect church. In fact, some people move from church to church to church to church to church to church because they're searching for that perfect church. Well, here's the question I would challenge you to think about this morning. What is that church you're looking for? What is it? What are the things that you're really looking for? What is the perfect church? And here's the second question I asked you. Does that church even exist? Now, this morning, we're going to answer both of those questions, and I'm going to start with the second question, and then we're going to spend most of our time answering the first question. And I think what you'll find is you'll be surprised by the answers that I'll give to these 2 questions. The second question, does the perfect church exist today? My answer to that question, I'm going to suggest that the answer to that question is yes, it does. In fact, I would suggest that there are a lot of perfect churches out there. But the perfect church is a lot different than what you might think it is. Last week, we started a brand new series called The Body, and the body refers to the church. Comes from verses like 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 27. Paul says, speaking to us as Christians, those who believed in Jesus, who are followers of Jesus, he says this. He says, now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. He's using this idea of the body, a human physical body, as a metaphor and an illustration of what the church is, what it's meant to be. In fact, this is where membership really comes from. Membership in the church isn't like joining a club. It's not like being a member of Sam's Club or Costco or whatever gym you may be a part of. That's not what we're talking. When we talk about membership, member isn't a club term, it's a medical term in this instance. To be a member is to be a functioning part of a body, a human body. Paul is saying the human body is a great picture of the church. Just as your body is made up of all sorts of diverse and unique parts, right? My fingers, my arms, my nose, my eyes, my ears, my toes, whatever else, all of these unique and diverse, different pieces. So the church is made up of all sorts of unique and diverse individuals, different cultures, different backgrounds, different families, different social economic statuses, different cities that we live in. We come from all sorts. We're very unique. We're diverse. We have different gifts and different abilities and different passions. Just as the human body is made up of all of these different pieces, so is the church. And just as the human body, in order to be healthy and function right, all of those parts have to work together, so is the same thing in the church. Yes, we're all individually members of it, but being individually members of it, we're all supposed to be working together in unity as one whole. And the way that works, the way that our bodies work when they're functioning the right way is you have a brain, you have a head with a brain in it, and that brain sends out impulses to the rest of your body to tell it what to do. Right? In order to pick up this Bible, we don't even really have to think about it, but in order for it to happen, your brain has to send impulses that says, okay, your arm's going to move, your hand's going to open, you're going to close around the Bible, you're going to pick it up, you're going to move it. A very simple thing that you don't even have to think about, but think of all of the things that had to go into just doing that one simple thing. He says the church, it's the same way. We have a head, and the head isn't any one of us. It isn't the pastor, it isn't the elders. The head of the church is Christ himself. He's our brain. He's the control of it all, and he's sending impulses out to every single one of us as a community of people who are meant to work together and function as one whole in response to him, our head and our king. And what this whole series is about is to say, okay, so what does that really look like? How do we be the church? And it's actually a great follow-up to our last series in Made New. Last series was really about the new life as an individual Christian. And this is about being individual Christians as a part of a community, because we aren't just saved into a relationship with us and Jesus, just me and Jesus. We're saved into a relationship, yes, a new right relationship with God, but also with each other. There's some people who think, well, why do we need the church? I don't need the church. I can follow Jesus on my own. And the Bible's answer is, no, you can't. And the reason that's the answer is because God's design is never for anyone to do their own walk with Him alone. It's never been the design, even from the creation of the world. Go back to Genesis. You remember God creates Adam, He creates the animals, He brings all the animals in front of Him. Do you remember the first time He says it's not good? Why does He say it isn't good? Because Adam's alone. Now, this is before sin, before the fall. Adam has a perfect relationship with God, but there's no one like him, and God says that's not good. It's not good for man to be alone. And so God creates Eve, and they have a community together in right relationship with God. That's design. That's God's design from the very beginning. And when sin comes in, it undoes the design. It breaks the relationship with God. But what else does it do? It breaks relationship with Adam and Eve. Sin is the undoing of God's design, and God's design is, yes, relationship with Him, but also with each other. And instantly, it breaks both relationships. And the gospel, the message of Jesus Christ, is coming in to restore us back to right relationship with God, back to our design, and that includes each other, which means that when God looks at a Christian and sees them alone, do you know what He says about that? Same thing He said about Adam in the garden by himself. That's not good. That's not God's design. And so this whole series is about what does it mean to be this church? What does it mean to be the church? And let me just walk you through the whole series. There's a simple way to remember everything we're going through, okay? Can you do this? I want you to hold up your left hand with me for just a moment. Don't have to hold it up here. Just hold it up. And let me walk through it, okay, in a fist. All right, put your thumb out. Here's what we did week 1. We talked about the community of the church. Think of it like a thumbs up. God started a brand new community. It's a radical community, and we'll talk about that in just a second. This week, we're going to be talking about, first finger, we're talking about the culture of the church. And think about it this way. The church can be a community that points the finger at other people and blames them. It can be a community that shakes its finger and judges everybody else, or it can be a community that invites people in. Next week, the middle finger, we're talking about conflict. I don't have to explain that. Fourth week, the ring finger, we're really talking about as the bride of Christ, we've been given power to conquer. What does it mean to be a conquering church, and what are we conquering? Are we conquering? And then the last week, the pinky finger, we're talking about being a contributing church. And, we think about the pinky, it's small, we might think it's insignificant, and here's what we're going to be looking at. It doesn't matter how small or insignificant you are, you play a vital role to the church being the church. You're here, and you being a part of it is the only way that we can truly be who God's called us to be. That's the whole series. Okay? Last week, Scott kicked us off. Week 1, we looked at Acts chapter 2. The Holy Spirit comes. Peter gets up on the day of Pentecost, and he preaches the first message of the church. And it's an amazing moment because think about this. People from all around the world have gathered together in Jerusalem. We're not talking about just cultural Jews. We're talking about Jews and Gentiles from around the world that have gathered into this city because of a celebration. It's just 50 days after the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. Peter gets up, he preaches the message on the day of Pentecost, and thousands are saved and baptized, and the church is born. And it's a radical community. It's a community that is practicing what we seek to practice today in our core values. The Word was the filter for them. They committed themselves to the teaching of the apostles. Right? Love was shaping their character. They had all things in common. They were doing life together, and they were caring for each other as they had need. Right? They were praying at all times. They were together always and spending time praying and seeking God and worshiping together. And they were going to grow because God continued to add to their number. And the only way that happens is that the church is the church, not just in walls, but out in the world. And so it's a community that as you read through Acts, it's literally turning the world upside down. And ever since that church, ever since the birth of the church, every church since then has been asking a very important question. How can we be like that? How can we be like that? There's the ideal church. There's a picture of what the church has been intended to be. Born through the work of the Spirit, the teaching of God's Word, through grace and by truth, through salvation that God gives. The church is born, and it is a radical, amazing community that is turning the world upside down. And every church since has been asking the question, there it is, there's the ideal, there's the perfect, how do we be like that? And what Paul this morning is doing here in Colossians chapter 3, in essence, is he's answering that question. And what we're going to find is, as he's answering the question of how can we be like that, he's also telling us what the perfect church really is. And as I said, what you're going to find is what I see as the perfect church and what Paul sees as the perfect church may be very different than what you think of as the perfect church. And I put the definition there in your notes. I left a blank in there, and I'll give it to you here in just a moment. But here's how I would define the perfect church based on what Paul is talking about here. And then I'm just going to walk you through it. We're going to kind of go through this passage along the lines of this definition. And here's the definition I'm going to give you. The perfect church is a committed community of imperfect followers of Jesus. That's the word. Imperfect is the word that's missing from your notes. The perfect church is a committed community of imperfect followers of Jesus who are practicing God's love while seeking God's best in each other's lives. I want to read it again, and we're going to walk through it. I'm going to repeat it throughout the morning. Because this definition, I really believe. Now, you may say, well, yeah, but what about this? And maybe you should add that, and that's fine. Look, this is my definition, and by definition, it's imperfect. Okay? It's good news. I came up with it, and I can tell you it's flawed. But I'm only basing it on the verses we're looking at this morning. There are other things that we could add to it, but I'm just putting it in the context of what we're looking at, and I'll walk you through it and show it to you this morning. But the perfect church is a committed community of imperfect followers of Jesus who are practicing God's love while seeking God's best in each other's lives. And we're going to walk through it, and my focus, as I said, is just going to be on these first three verses. I'm going to start in verse 11, and we're going to work through verse 14. And the reason I'm just going to focus on those is because Paul's going to get to some very practical actions that we should be taking, but he doesn't start with our behaviors. He starts with our hearts. He's getting to the culture of the church. And listen, the culture of this church is defined by the hearts of the people here. And if we're going to change the culture, we've got to change our hearts. Before we can talk about all of the functions and behaviors and things that we ought to be doing, we've got to talk about our hearts. Because, listen, Jesus says it, out of your heart, out of the overflow of your heart, your mouth speaks. What comes out of your life, your behaviors and your words, your attitudes and your actions, they're all birthed from right in here, your heart. And so if we're going to change our actions and our participation as a community, we've got to get below the surface, below our behaviors to our hearts, which is exactly what, you look at verse 12 and Paul says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. What does he say? Compassionate what? Hearts. He says before we talk about any behaviors, we're going to talk about heart attitudes. Because our heart attitudes is what's going to shape the culture. And if we're really looking for the right kind of culture, then we have to get to the heart attitudes that are going on, and we've got to see those change. And it's not passive, it's intentional, as we're going to talk about this morning. But here's the first thing. Paul says, number one, it's a community of imperfect followers of Jesus Christ. And this is extremely important. Because some Christians put an impossible expectation on the church to be this community where no one sins and no one has any conflict and we all just get along. We don't have any problems. And here's the issue with that. It's an impossible expectation. It's not reality. And when we believe things that aren't true about the church, it impacts our ability to be the church that God's called us to be. Paul says in verse 11, take a look at it. He says, here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ all and in all. He says, you are a brand new community, and it is a community of difference that have been united together. A community of unique and diverse individuals with different kind of backgrounds and different kinds of social statuses and different wealth, all sorts of cultural differences. And here's what we've done. We've been brought into a community where we've been united. Our diversity has been united together. It's not that we're not diverse anymore. It's just that our diversity doesn't divide us. The church in Colossae, which is who's Paul's writing to, it faces a unique challenge at this point in time. Because in this church are Jews and Gentiles in community together. And that's pretty radical because up to this point in time, Gentiles weren't allowed to be a part of Jewish community. Right? They weren't allowed into the synagogue. They weren't allowed into the temple. There were outside courts of the Gentiles where they were restricted to because they couldn't be allowed in. And now here you have the church, and it's a totally new thing. Jews and Gentiles are actually together worshiping God as one. And you can think about it like this. Jesus in Luke 15 teaches the parable of the prodigal son. It's really the parable of the two brothers and the loving father. But in that story, there's two brothers. You've got the younger brother, who is the immoral, I'm going to go and live however I want and blow all this money on wild living. And then you've got the older brother, who's the moral one, who stays home and keeps all the rules. One of the things that people miss is that both brothers are actually estranged from the father. When the younger brother comes home, the father comes out, invites the younger son in, let's throw a party. The older brother gets upset. Why? Because, well, I've kept all the rules. Where's my party? And the father comes out and invites him in. The younger brother, the immoral one, is the one that comes in, and the older brother refuses. And here's how you can think about it. The older brother, the rule followers, are the Jews. They've been doing, they haven't really been keeping all the rules, but in their minds they have been keeping all the rules. And the younger brothers, the immoral ones, are the Gentiles who've been going off and living their own way. And now God's brought older brothers and younger brothers into a community together where they're supposed to be unified. And what do you expect is going to happen? The same thing that happens whenever you bring two unique, fallen, broken, imperfect individuals into a relationship together. It's conflict. I mean, look at the list that Paul gives to us here. All right, let's just read through it. He says, put on therefore compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so also you must forgive. What does that list assume? What is it telling us? There's going to be conflict. I mean, why in the world do you need forgiveness if it's a community without conflict? Right? The reason that you need forgiveness is because you got a group of people that are going to sin against each other, they're going to hurt each other, and what do you need? You're going to have to forgive each other. Where is it that you need patience? See, you don't need patience when everything's working the way that it should and everybody's doing the right things and we're all functioning in unity together. The place that you need patience is when people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing and they're not doing it consistently. Right? One of the things that I need to continue to grow in as a father of 4 sons is in patience. As a father, there are times, and I've probably said this before because it's just the experience of my life, is there are times where it feels like I'm herding cats. Dinner time in our house is an amazing experience, and that's not a good thing. They're constantly moving, and it's like trying to get them to sit still it's a battle. Particularly Eli, he's our 7-year-old, and Eli has all of this energy inside of him. What is it that he said the other day? God put joy in his heart? Is that what it was? God just put joy in my heart. And that's a wonderful thing, Eli, but you still have to sit still sometimes. So, we're sitting at the dinner table one particular night, and like, he'd be eating, and then he just gets up and starts walking around. You need to sit down. And okay, yeah, I'll sit down. And you start eating, and then he gets up and he just starts walking around, and over and over. And finally, and I was joking, just for anybody who gets nervous about this, I finally said to him, Eli, if you don't stay in your seat, I'm going to duct tape you to it. And he laughed about it. He said, okay, yeah, I'm going to stay in my seat. I'll stay in my seat. And he's eating. I'm telling you, just a few seconds later, he's up out of his seat. I went and got the duct tape, and I made a little seat belt for him in his chair because I'm like, you're going to stay. And we all had a good laugh about it, and now he still doesn't stay in his seat. But it's like there's this ongoing challenge where the times that you need forgiveness and the times that you need patience and the times that you need gentleness and humility is in a community where things don't always go the way that they're supposed to. And again, this is extremely important because when you expect it to be perfect, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get frustrated. Why? Because you're expecting it to be better than what it is. You're expecting we're not going to have any problems, but when there are problems, you get frustrated, you get disappointed, you get discouraged, you get angry, sometimes you get really bitter, and it's so easy to turn that back around on God and go, well, is any of this even true if the church is this messed up? Maybe it's not even worth it at all. I mean, we are in a time of unbelievable communication. You know everything that's going on, but we've seen so many, just in the last year and a half, we've seen so many major prominent pastors who have fallen because of sin in their lives, particularly the sin of pride. Some really well-known, and people look at that and they go, well, how can that happen? And don't get me wrong, listen, as pastors and teachers, there is a standard that we're called to, and it's an expectation. But at the same time, there's people walking around as if they're shocked and surprised that a pastor could sin. Do you understand that I am just as sinful as you? I grew up in a church where I always thought that my pastor was perfect. I want to take away the facade for you. I'm messed up. I'm broken. I sin. And I'm not going to give you the list right now, but I'm not afraid to share it with you because I have real problems. The things that go on in your life, you're not alone. You're not the only one here in this room. You see, when we believe that the church should be perfect, one thing that we do is we disconnect from it because we look around and we go, well, I don't really want to waste my time with all these people because it's just going to be problem after problem after problem, and this isn't the way it's supposed to be. I'm sorry, Paul assumes that it's going to be a problem. Because the perfect church isn't flawless. The perfect church is not sin-free. Why? Because it's made up of people like us who are broken and who have been saved by grace, and we're in process. But the other thing that we do is we hide. We hide. You hide. I hide. And here's what I mean by that is we don't get into community because if we are expecting perfection, we look in the mirror and guess what we don't see? We don't see perfection. And we're afraid that if we start getting into a relationship, what people will see is we're actually real sinners. See, if you are expecting perfection, not only will you avoid people because you don't want to deal with their sin, you will hide from people because you don't want people to see your sin. And the problem with all of that is that it actually negates our ability to be who God's called us to be. It actually stops us from growing to be the church that God has called us to be. Paul says, here's what we have to do. We have to assume that this community, to be a perfect church, is not to be flawless. It's not to be sin-free because sin is a part of our process. Christianity isn't about perfection. It's about progression. Progression assumes that we're going to still mess up and fail. This list tells us the perfect church isn't flawless. It is a community of imperfect followers of Jesus, with flawed sinners who've been saved by grace. But number two, it's a community. It doesn't stop. We're not just a community of imperfect followers of Jesus. We're a community of imperfect followers of Jesus who are committed to one another. Not only does this list tell us that we should expect problems, but it also tells us that the goal is to stay together. Why do you need forgiveness? Why do you need patience? You see, the danger is that when problems come up, we run away. It gets hard, and we go, forget it, I'm done. But here's what Paul says. Look at verse 13. He says, bearing with one another. Do you know what that means? It means we don't give up, we put up with each other. I mean, literally, it means that we put up with each other, and that may sound negative, but here's what Paul's saying. He's saying, listen, it's going to get tough. It's going to get difficult. People are going to sin against you. People are going to hurt you, and your temptation is going to be to give up and to walk away. And I've seen it so many times. I remember that we were at a point in time, and I'm just going to tell you this story because it's just a part of my journey. But we were at a point 12 years ago. I was in Naperville, and I was a youth pastor, and we were going through a tough time. I had friends who were leaving the church. In fact, just about 2 months ago, I got together with an old friend of mine who literally just one day up and disappeared and stopped communicating. And I sat down with him, and I said, tell me what happened. I finally had reached out to him. He reached out to me. We got together, and I said, tell me what happened. You just disappeared. You stopped talking. What happened? He says, you know what? There were so many problems, I just gave up and I walked away. You see, that's the temptation. That's the danger, is that we have this expectation it should be better than what it is. We go through the hard times and we get frustrated, and so we give up and we walk away. I was even tempted. Listen, I was at a point where I was disenchanted with ministry. I was frustrated with it, and I was thinking about walking away. And in the midst of praying and asking God to provide the opportunity to walk away, God put on my heart and basically said, Dan, I want you to stay. I want you to stay. And at the time, I was reading a book, and there was a quote in the book from Gandhi, and Gandhi wasn't a believer, but he's exactly right. He says, and it's a quote that a lot of people know. I didn't know it at the time. It says, it's be the change you want to see in the world. And the way that I read that was, be the change that you want to see in the church. Yeah, you know, the church has problems. It's flawed. And yes, you could run away, but you know what happens when we run away from the problem, we run away from conflict, we run away from broken relationships with each other? Do you know what happens? 2 things happen. Number 1, you don't grow. There's a reason that commitment is a part of relationship. By the way, there's a reason that commitment is a part of marriage. It's easier to run away, but the problem is when you run away, you miss the opportunity to grow, because in the conflict, there's your opportunity to practice what God has been giving to you. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But Paul says the goal is to stay together, because when you don't, you miss the opportunity to grow. But not only do you miss the opportunity to grow, we as a church miss the opportunity to grow. Why? Because when you leave, we don't get to work through the problem. I've seen people as a lead pastor now for 9, 10 years. I've seen people just get up and walk away, and they never share why they're leaving. And that's so discouraging to me. Here's why. Because I know we have problems. I know that we're imperfect. I know there are things that everybody could pick at and say, well, this is wrong and that's wrong. Why don't we do this differently? And maybe I get that we have problems. But do you know the only way it gets better is if we do it together? It's the only way. Is if we do it together. We practice it together. And that's really what Paul is getting at. It's a community. The perfect church is not flawless. It is a committed community of imperfect followers of Jesus who are practicing God's love while seeking God's best in each other's lives. That's what Paul is saying. He says, look at verse 12 again. He says, put on then. He's talking about clothing. And if you actually read a little bit further up, he actually says, you got to take off. You've got to remove some old clothes. And what you'll find if you read that list is every single one of those descriptors that he uses to say that we got to stop doing these things are relationally disintegrating practices, because that's what sin does. Sin doesn't just destroy your relationship with God, it destroys your relationships with other people. And now he's going to talk about putting on, he's talking about clothing in terms of the Christian life. And what he's saying is, you and I have to be as intentional as you were about getting dressed this morning. You have to be just as intentional, I would say even more intentional, about practicing God's love. We have to be just as intentional as practicing God's love together, right? You got up this morning. I'm guessing you got changed. I'm assuming somebody picked out your clothes. Maybe you didn't pick them out. Right? But you got clothes, you took off the old clothes, you put on the new clothes so that you could come in here and be a part of the service. Right? You were intentional about it. They didn't just jump on you. It wasn't accidental. You had to do it. Paul says, here's what we have to do. If we're going to be the kind of community that God has called us to be, then here's what we have to do. We have to be putting on this new life. We have to actually be practicing these things together. And it's not passive. It's very intentional. And he gives us this list, and he summarizes it in verse 14. Look at it with me. He says, and above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. He says, here's what we have to do. We have to practice love. We have to put it on. It's not something that's going to happen. It's not something we're just going to fall into. It's something that we have to actually work at. We have to practice it. We have to be intentional with it. See, love is the overarching descriptor of the Christian life. In John chapter 13, you remember? Jesus says, this is how the world is going to know that you're my disciples. By what? How you love one another. So the world's going to know we're his followers if we're actually loving each other. That's the descriptor. And if we love each other, then here's what Paul is saying. See, that's the one that binds it all together in perfect unity. Here's why. Because it's the one that produces everything else. See, if you love, then here's what. If you're putting on love, then you'll have a compassionate heart. If you love, then you're going to be putting on kindness. If you love, you're going to be putting on humility. If you love, you're going to be putting on forgiveness. And think about this for just a moment. When's the best time to practice love? Think about it. When's the best time to practice love? God's love. I want to suggest that one of the best times to practice God's love is when the community's broken and we're sinning against each other. I want you to hear me. Don't get me wrong here. Just stick with me for a moment. I'm not saying that sin is good, but in this community, sin is an opportunity. Romans chapter 5:8, God showed his love for us in this, that while we were yet sinners, what? Christ died for us. God's love was practiced towards us in the face of our sin. And what better time to practice and put on love than when we're in broken relationship together? You remember when Jesus was actually teaching that when we love each other, that's how the world will know you're my disciples. Right before that, he washed his disciples' feet. Do you remember whose feet he washed when he was washing all the disciples' feet? It's Judas. Listen, I'm going to read this. When we are not honest about our sin, when we're not close enough to sin against each other because we limit being the church to this room, it's difficult to sin against each other in here. When we limit being the church to just being in this room, we actually keep ourselves and each other from the growth that God intends. Because as we're in community and as our lives bump up against each other, as we're imperfect, listen, my sin gives you the opportunity to grow in the love of Christ. Your sin gives me the opportunity. And as we are in community together, we actually get the opportunity to grow. And by the way, here's how we do it. How do we clothe ourselves with love? 2 simple steps. I'm going to walk through this briefly. Here's how we do this. Yeah, how do we be this kind of a community? Number 1, you've got to be living in and out of God's love. You've got to be living in and out of God's love. It's where Paul starts in verse 12. He says, put in then, it's God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. He says, before I talk about all the things you've got to clothe yourselves with, I'm going to talk about putting on God's love. Let's remember how God has loved you. Number 1, He chose you. He knew everything about you. He knew all your sin, past, present, and future, and He chose you. Not only did He choose you, He made you holy. Not that you're sinless. It's not that you don't ever sin, but He made you positionally holy, that when He looks at you through the perfection of His Son. And you're not just loved, you're beloved. You are dearly loved. You are loved with a love that has been so poured out on you. It is so much greater than what you can understand. You can't even understand it. It's so great. God's love is a universe, and you can't grasp the size of it, but you can live in it. You cannot give what you don't have. If we're going to be a community that practices love, which then flows into patience and kindness and gentleness and compassion and humility and meekness, if we're going to be that community, you have to actually be dwelling in that love. But listen, God hasn't just chosen you and made you holy, and you're not just the only one beloved. You know what? So is the person sitting next to you. And the person sitting next to them, and the person sitting across the room. See, not only do we have to dwell in that love, but here's what we have to do. We have to let that love actually flow through us. We have to become channels and conduits for the love of God that flows into our lives, that then flows out into the lives of people around us. Let me just put it in the context of love. He says, love, put on love which binds them all together in perfect harmony. Remember 1 John 4:18, We love because what? He first loved us. In other words, love doesn't originate with us. We're not to give people our own love. We are to give the love that He's given to us. It's meant to flow through us out to others. God's love is a river, and your life isn't meant to be the dam that holds it back. It's meant to be the conduit and the channel that it actually flows through to everybody around you. Paul makes it very clear in verse 13 when he says forgive. He says forgive as what? As the Lord has forgiven you. In other words, you're not to give people your own forgiveness. He doesn't say forgive because other people deserve it or because they've earned it or because they've said sorry or anything else. He says, here's why you forgive. You forgive because God has forgiven you. In other words, you're to take God's forgiveness and actually let that flow through you to the people around you. Put it in the context of patience. Right? I told you that's something that I need to work on. I continue to strive on. I think I've grown. You can ask my wife. She'll be honest with you. I think I've grown in patience. But I remember, I think I've shared this story with you before. There was one day where Sarah was gone. It was just me, and I think the 4 boys at this point in time. And I made it my goal because I was struggling with patience. I was like, I'm going to be patient all day today. And you know, there's those moments where you feel like the kids conspire together against you. It's like they went down into the playroom, and Will was like, you know, Dad's trying to pretend like we don't know this, but he made the goal to not lose it today. He's going to be patient. And Sam gets a smile on his face, and he goes, let's break him. And Eli, he's the orchestrator. He tells everybody what to do, and he goes, okay, so Will, you're going to do this. Eli, Titus, you do this. Sam, you do that. And then when you do that, I'm going to do that. And it was like all day long. They kept coming, and I was working at it. I was trying, and they broke me. And I just was like, are you kidding me? I can't, and I reflected on that day, and I thought, why was it that I wasn't able to be patient? Do you want to know why? Because I wasn't being a conduit. I was trying to give them my patience rather than allowing God's patience to flow through me. Do you want to know what it looks like to clothe yourself with this stuff? It's intentional. It's not passive. Here's what it looks like in my life. In the moments where I'm herding cats and the kids are doing all their stuff and I'm starting to lose patience, do you know what I need to do in that moment? I need to clothe myself in the love, patience, love of God. And here's what that looks like for me. I have to stop and remember God's patience with me. I have to remember all the times that God could come down and say, Dan, you know, sometimes working with you is like herding cats. I tell you to go over here and like you're over there for 30 seconds and then you're like squirrel and you're over there and you're doing something over here and I'm just trying to get you on this straight path and you're kind of all over the place. How many times could God say that to me? How many times could God say, Dan, how many times do I have to tell you the same thing? How many times do I have to say, stop doing that? And he could come down and lose it and get frustrated with me and say, what's wrong with you? Why can't you get it together? And yet God has been unbelievably patient with me every single day, every single moment, every single week, month after month, year after year, that God goes, Dan, you still got a long ways to go, and I'm still walking with you through this. I'm still leading you, and I haven't given up on you. And you see, as I remember that, as I clothe myself in that, do you know what happens? My heart, the internal culture of my life gets changed, and I become a conduit, a channel where God's love now has, God's patient love has the opportunity to flow through me to my kids, and I get to give them that. And that's what it looks like as a community together. We got to be close enough to sin, and as we sin, to then allow to clothe ourselves with that and to give that to each other. And as we do that together, here's what happens. We grow. Paul says the perfect church isn't a church that's flawless. Come on. That's an impossibility. You know what? One day we will be. And you know where that's going to happen? Eternity. Until then, we're a group of flawed followers of Jesus who need to be committed to each other, who need to seek to practice God's love while seeking God's best for each other. That's the perfect community. That's what it looks like. And by the way, five very quick things. If we're going to be that kind of church, here's what has to happen. Number one, you've got to be living in and out of God's love. And the question you have to ask this morning is, number one, have you actually experienced and received that love in your life? Have you accepted that this love that Paul is describing for us here is the way that God has loved you? That he was compassionate. He empathized with your sin, your struggle in your sin. And he was kind, which is compassion moved to action. He came to do for you what you couldn't do for yourself. And that Jesus humbled himself. He had power under control and meekness. And he moved that, instead of using it in judgment, he used it for your salvation. And he paid the full penalty on the cross for your sins so that you could be eternally forgiven and to know the unending, unmeasurable love of God. Have you accepted and experienced that? Are you living in that? And then, Christian, if you aren't, today the invitation is to believe and accept that. And if you have already done that, then the question is, are you living out of that? Or have you moved to that place, Christian, where you're trying to find your identity more in what you do for God than what God has done for you? You've got to be living in and out of his love. Number two, we've got to get close to each other. That means we've got to stop just showing up to a service and running out the door. We actually need relationship. We need community. It's why we have equipping hours. It's why right after this, we have groups that meet together to discuss what we're talking about. It's why we have life groups. It's why we have men's ministry. Why we have women's ministry. And I get it. Some people go, well, yeah, but it's imperfect. Well, welcome to the club. So are you. And guess what? The only way it gets better is if you're a part of it. It's the only way we're going to grow. You know, when you're disengaged, when you're unwilling to get close enough to let people to sin against you and for you to sin against them, do you know what you're doing? You're keeping yourself from growing, but you're also keeping other people from growing. God has you here so that other people can help you grow and you can help them grow. You got to get engaged. You have to get involved. Number three, you have to be committed. You know, we've had close to 20 people go through the membership process in the recent days. And again, membership isn't about signing up for a gym or a benefits package. It's about saying, I'm willing to actually be a fully functioning part of this body so that we can accomplish God's purpose. You've got to get committed, and that means you have to be willing to endure the hard stuff with people. And then number four, you've got to practice. I don't have time to go through all of this passage, but here's the challenge. You have to. You need to go and you need to read through this passage, and then two things you need to do. Number one, you need to do some self-evaluation. Where are you doing well in these things? Where are you practicing it? And then number two, where do you need to grow? And here's good news, bad news. Good news is everybody's got something to celebrate. Bad news is everybody's got room to grow. Where do you need to grow? And then number two, you need to say, here are the intentional, practical steps I'm going to take to actually put this on and practice this out. You've got to get intentional. Include people in the process. And then here's the last thing. We got to make room for failure. Do you know failure is not our enemy? Passivity is. If you never fail, it's because you're not trying. If we never fail, it's because we are not trying. We need to make room for failure because being a Christian is not about perfection, but progression, and progression assumes process, which means we should expect there's going to be failure. We need to make room for failures because we all fail. And this community should be the best place to fail. Because when we fail, we won't turn our backs on each other and walk away. We also won't condemn each other and throw away our relationships. But we will lovingly commit to working for God's best in each other's lives as we put on and practice the love of God in each other's lives. We're going to talk about more about that next week. We're going to get more detailed into really what do we do when we have conflict. How do we walk through that? But listen, the perfect church is a committed community of imperfect followers of Jesus who are practicing God's love while seeking God's best in each other's lives. Are you a part of that?